Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. Whether you're a first-time listener or you're returning, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Currently, only 3 out of the 100 listeners, cumulative, are subscribed to the podcast, and we're trying to increase that to 1,000 before I go back to Duke in the Fall. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Doug Perlman. Doug is the founder and CEO at SportsMediaAdvisors. He's the former founding partner at Accrue Sports and Entertainment Ventures, the former president at IMG Media North America, former EVP of Media at the National Hockey League, a former attorney at Proskauer Rose LLP, and he is a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Law and a graduate of Duke University. I'm incredibly excited to speak to Doug today. Doug, you've worked at the National Hockey League, IMG, and as an attorney. Having seen all of these different areas of the world, how do these all interconnect, and how did that lead you to found Sports Media Advisors?
It's a broad question, and I often will talk to people who are interested in getting into sports, and I talk about they're often interested in sort of the career path, etc. And I always say to them, it always sounds more linear in the retelling, right? In real life, there's zigs and zags and twists and turns, but there is a line from law school to what I'm doing today. As you mentioned, I was a Duke undergrad, then got out of UVA Law School. And while I was at UVA, decided I wanted to pursue a career in sports and entertainment law. And so I went to Proskauer Rose, which you mentioned, which has the leading sports practice. They represent all the leagues. David Stern and Gary Bettman came out of there, along with literally hundreds of others of folks sprinkled throughout the sports industry. And that was my exposure to the industry. And then a couple of years in, I got an offer to go to the NHL, which was a client. Spent about 10 years there, ended up running the media business there, and then went to IMG to be president of IMG Media, as you said. And then after a little bit of time at IMG, I decided to start my own firm. We can talk about that if you're interested, but I had always wanted to do my own thing, and I saw a moment in time where I really saw that opportunity to give it a shot. And I think we're 16 or 17 years in, and so far so good, knock on wood. So each sort of stop along the way prepared me for what I ultimately did with my career, which was to start a firm focused on the sports media industry.
Funnily enough, one of my prior guests, I think he was one of my first 10 or 20 guests, and I've now done over 70 episodes of Personable, was actually a guy by the name of Guy Kinnings, who was president of the golf at IMG. So I wonder if you had any crossover there.
A little bit, yeah. Our paths definitely crossed, and I certainly know the name, and he's done a lot of amazing things.
Something that you're probably most known for now is founding and running Sports Media Advisors. For those that don't know, could you explain what it is and why you decided to set up your own firm?
Yeah, sure. So Sports Media Advisors is not a very creative name, right? Nobody's going to hire us for creative marketing. It is an advisory firm focused on sports media. As I said, I founded it 16 or 17 years ago. And I always say that we really do 3 things. The first is we advise sports properties on their media business. So think, leagues, teams, tournaments, conferences, university athletic departments, national governing bodies, anybody that owns media rights for content that can be distributed. We'll give them strategic counsel, and we'll often negotiate their TV deals. So strategic counsel is against the backdrop of all the changes in the industry. People are cutting the cord, and the rise of direct-to-consumer, and the influence of social and gambling and AI. What does that all mean for these sports properties that are trying to generate revenue and best serve their fans? And as I said, for many of them, that will lead to negotiating their primary, what people still call TV deals, but of course they're multi-platform, media rights distribution deals. So that's the first bucket. And I always say we've worked with everyone from pickleball to the NFL and literally everyone in between, probably every sport you could think of and a bunch that you wouldn't, including most of the major properties, etc. So that's kind of the first bucket. The second, which has become a bigger and bigger part of our practice, is working with private equity firms. As they have a bigger role in the space, a number of the biggest firms have retained us to help them think about the future of rights fees. So if you're going to invest in a team, people will hire us to get our best sense of what their next media rights deal will look like, or and if they're part of a league, what that league deal will look like. So that's the private equity sort of bucket, if you will. And then the third is a little harder to describe, but we help a lot of companies to navigate the sports landscape. It's a very idiosyncratic, relationship-driven industry. So different companies will hire us to say, hey, sometimes it's a big company with a new line of business. Sometimes it's an earlier stage media and tech company, and we'll help them with go-to-market strategy or business planning, or really importantly, getting them in front of the right people with the right message and kind of leveraging our credibility. So that's a long-winded answer to a very simple question, but that's what SMA does. That's largely what we've been doing since we started. The emphasis will shift, the details will shift, but at a high level, that's what we've been doing.
From as you can probably tell, I'm not American, but from a PE perspective, many of the basketball teams, NFL teams, etc., that have sold or at least sold minority stakes have been, eye-wateringly large numbers. Do you expect that these PE deals will continue to go up in value, or do you think we're in an overinflated market? And do you think the continual focus will be on the MLB, the NFL, the NBA, or do you think it will start to look at other sports like pickleball that you mentioned?
Well, I'll take your second question first. I mean, I think there's institutional money and high net worth individuals that are looking at the full range of sport. So you definitely have people that are focused on these minority stakes at MLB and the NBA and the NHL and the NFL. No doubt about that. And those are certainly the biggest numbers. But there's also a lot of folks out there who are trying to focus on the next big thing, right? We've mentioned pickleball a couple of times. Women's sports receives a ton of attention, and rightly so. There's a lot of growth opportunities there. People are looking at rugby and cricket and lacrosse, et cetera. So I think you have folks that are interested in both from an investment perspective. And then to your first question, I think it's a case-by-case analysis, right? Not every investment will pay off. But I certainly think that, there's a lot of smart money coming into the space. And I think in general, folks are going to continue to do well because there's nothing that people are more passionate about than sports. And that just drives so much value across so many lines of business. So I think in general, people will continue to do well.
I think something with this podcast, and even from the point in which I reach out to guests with, I kind of have 3 to 5 of the top guests that I've had, or at least guests that have the biggest brand name. But when I was scrolling through your website before, it was almost unbelievable the amazingly huge and well-known brands that you've been able to connect with. What do you think the key is to getting good clients? Is it having brilliant ideas, great experience, or something else?
It's a great question, and thank you for the comment. Yeah, we've been really fortunate to have worked with a lot of the biggest brands in sport. I think so much of our business is rooted in really 2 things. Our expertise in the sports media space, and we have been focused on it for a long time and have a lot of domain expertise. And I like to think that we're well regarded in terms of our strategic thinking and analytical thinking and our ability to negotiate these critical deals. So that's obviously really important, kind of in its essence, just being good at what you do. But just as important is the relationships that we've built throughout the industry over all these years. I mean, that's so important to so many industries. We've grown up in the sports space. We've kind of grown up around so many key figures in the industry, and they've become good friends, and I'd like to think that they have respect for what we do. So that's really where the business comes from. The vast majority of our business, it comes from folks that we know or might be one removed, right? Someone who's got a media business, they call their friend at the NFL, and the NFL recommends us. So we get a lot of those kind of calls, which are always incredibly gratifying. And again, so much of it is rooted in our expertise, of course, but also our relationships and reputation for, the way we do things. So I think at the end of the day, it really boils down to that.
Kind of going a step further and deeper into that idea, something I thought when I was younger, when you hear the idea of maybe not president, but VP, which is now, investment banking is not as high as VP in another organization. A lot of people have a lot of titles, and that can be a big incentive for people to be called something nice rather than actually having to do work that gives them more leadership and power within organizations. But you've not only had great titles and done great things, but that's transcended into the organization you lead today. You kind of mentioned that, the trust lies in the relationships, but I want to go a step further in truly understanding that, because as I've kind of just mentioned, there are a lot of people with a lot of high up roles, but there is still a decision these profit incentivized organizations are making to choose you and then choose you consistently. Meanwhile, I'm sure failures are inevitable. So how do you get over failures over time and enable these partners to consistently trust you and perform even though it doesn't go right 100% of the time?
That's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is, the longevity of a lot of these relationships, right? And I think a lot of the people that are key decision makers in the industry have sort of engaged with me in a variety of contexts over the years. And I think they've hopefully liked what they've seen, and that's led to a lot of the business that you generously described. So I think that that's a big part of it. And of course, when failures occur, as they inevitably do, I think smart analytical people try to unpack what drove the failure, right? And not when a business fails, it's not always because the CEO didn't know what they were doing, right? There's a number of factors that one can consider. And of course, if there's a deal or situation where there's an outcome that's less than optimal, again, I think smart analytical folks will kind of try to unpack it and see, was it what was the driver of that outcome? So hopefully, when people try to look at anything that we've done, they have a real positive view of the role that we've played, no matter what the circumstance. And, sometimes doubling someone's rights fee is a huge success, and sometimes that's less than one would hope for, right? So again, I think the smarter, more sophisticated potential partner understands the industry and looks at that, and fortunately for us, they continue to come back to us with more and more business.
If I was to ask you the question, how do you do big deals? I'm sure your answer would go back to experience, and you would be able to point out specific scenarios about having done that in the past and why you'd be able to do that moving forward. But there must have been a critical point in your time when you went from doing smaller deals to bigger ones. What was that transition like? And is there a story that you'd be able to tell, about what that process was like of doing your first big deal?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you ask the question, I'll tell you what leapt to mind, but although I'm not sure it was exactly what you envisioned when you asked the question. Like I think back to a deal that I did at the NHL, which was very much a lucky break for me. I was a young lawyer at the NHL. Again, I had gone there to join the legal department, which I was thrilled to do. And this was the mid-90s, and this will sound very strange to you, but the NHL was not in the digital business, right? NHL.com was, maybe we were posting our schedules on NHL.com. It was really nothing. And IBM came to the NHL and said, let's form a joint venture. IBM will contribute the capital and the technology. The NHL will contribute the intellectual property, the marks and logos and video, et cetera, that the NHL owns and controls. And let's get the NHL into the digital age. And this, the future is bright, and it's going to look like this, and let's do it together, which is a really cool, interesting deal. And again, I was really fortunate in that there was nobody at the league that knew anything about that, including me. But it's not like we had, give this to the digital business person or the lawyer who's done 3 digital deals. There was none. So I was staffed on that along with our general counsel, but he was, a well-established guy who didn't really know anything about it. And I just threw myself into it. And I literally went out and bought Internet for Dummies. The yellow Internet.
Yeah.
I was like, I just figured I had to, learn it any way I could. And the negotiation took months because it was very complex. And the more we got into it, the more I saw, and I'm not saying this was brilliant on my part, but the more that I saw it was going to affect every aspect of the business. So I was meeting with the head of media, which ended up later being my job, but I was meeting with the head of media because we knew someday there was going to be live games on this. And I was meeting with the head of licensing because someday we were going to sell products. And I was meeting with the head of sponsorship because someday our sponsors would participate. And I was meeting with the head of PR because we had to think about how to break stories. And was this website going to be objective or be more of a cheerleader for the NHL, which was a question way back then. And I was just blown away by how it was going to change all aspects of the business. So one, it was an incredibly fun, exciting, interesting deal to do, which was a great feeling, right? Not everybody feels that way about their job, but I was like energized and had adrenaline as I did that deal, and would go home thinking about it and like wake up with an idea for a deal point and write it down. I was just totally energized by it. And two, I ultimately ended up, speaking to, my boss and the commissioner, et cetera, and asking for a role in running digital once that venture was started. So that was really my lucky break, in that I got to I moved from a lawyer to a business person, which had always been in the back of my mind, and into digital media, which obviously ended up becoming a huge part of the sports industry. So I'm not sure if that's what you were asking about, and I'm happy to reframe. You can ask the question again, and I'll go down a different path. But that's when I think about sort of like a big deal that kind of transformed my role in the industry. That was certainly it. And if you're wondering, we did do the joint venture. It lasted for a number of years. The NHL had the right to buy IBM out, which they ultimately did, but it was a lot of fun and a kind of a seminal deal.
Yeah, I mean, at the core, that was my question exactly, because, from an external point of view, it could be about the numbers or the name or etc. But when it's actually what you're thinking in your head, like what was the point where the pressure was on? So that hit the crux and the core of my question. Something I'm constantly on the lookout for my podcast, being a host, is the ability to ask questions or to gain perspective in a new way. And I've kind of worked out that there's one way I can do that is by doing new things, and that will give me a new perspective, or by asking other people for their perspectives because they've had new experiences. And I was chatting to my brother before this, and I was like, my brother's called Freddie, and I was like, Freddie, I'm interviewing this guy called Doug, just on my podcast in 5 minutes time. What's one question you want to ask him? He was there thinking, couldn't really come up with anything, and then he had this question, and I think it's a pretty good one, so I'll ask it to you.
Sure.
So we've clearly seen your list, and I mentioned it before, of all the incredible people that you've worked with. Who is the biggest partner that you would want to work with? And if you've already achieved it, aka you've already climbed Everest, what's next, and how do you keep yourself motivated?
Meaning a client that we've not yet worked with that we would like to?
It's more that, like, if your dream was to work with the UFC or the NFL, like, have you already worked with that partner? And if not, who would they be? But if you have worked with them, how do you keep yourself going if you've already, got the biggest partner that you wanted in your career?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, as you say, and we have worked with most of the biggest properties in the U.S. The NFL. We've done work with the NBA and MLB and UFC and NASCAR and Ryder Cup and U.S. Soccer and on and on. We have been very fortunate. So continuing to work with those folks and be helpful to them, I hope is a part of our future and a priority for us, because of course we never take anything for granted, and we want to continue to partner with those folks and help them either as advisors or by bringing them companies with whom we're working to try to partner with them and help them further their business. So certainly continuing to serve those kinds of clients is a huge priority for us. And of course, it's incredibly gratifying when a client, brings you return business, right? That speaks well for what you did in the past. And of course, we love that. In terms of others that are out there, I don't have one sort of holy grail. There's not one that I say, boy, I wish I,
You can't say that. You'd get, the others wouldn't be happy if you said that.
Exactly. So, we haven't done them all, but I think we do put a lot of energy and thought into continuing to work with the folks that the kinds of folks that I mentioned that we've worked with in the past. And there's a lot of others that I failed to mention who we love too and want to continue to work with.
But where does I think the second part of that question was if you're a climber and you've climbed Mount Everest, and from your perspective, in what the work you're doing, you've already worked with the NFL, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What keeps you motivated? How do you keep going if you've already kind of reached that mountaintop?
I don't think of it as having reached the mountaintop, I guess. That there's always new matters. There's always new interesting deals to do. There's always things that I'm reading about or talking about with folks where I think, I want that piece of business. That excites me. That's interesting to me. So I don't think of it as a finish line or as a Mount Everest at all. I'm proud of what we built. I'm proud of the work that we've done, et cetera. But I've never thought, all right, well, we've got this engagement and now there's nothing more to motivate me. To be honest with you, not even close. Like, I think we celebrate those victories, of course. We celebrate it when we get a new client. We celebrate it when we close a deal on great terms for the client. But then, that's one of the really, really neat parts about our industry is it's changing so fast. Like the sports media industry, and of course, media industry more broadly, looks nothing like it did when we started this firm. So it's always changing. There's always new, interesting things that can be done. And so there's always that sort of excitement about getting a new engagement because it's good for the business, but also you want to dig your teeth in and engage and hopefully put up more wins. So that's definitely how I think about it.
Something that was kind of known before Donald Trump came into power for his second term was the idea that, there's a lot of people working in the government, people are, whether you're on the left or the right, they're spending in certain places that maybe shouldn't be spent in others. And his sort of attitude towards that has been the introduction of Doge to cut down, don't need overstaffing and to cut down costs in certain ways. Looking through your own company site, it seems you run a pretty lean team whilst also focusing on a lot of different areas and having a huge amount of high quality clients. From a leadership perspective, what's the strategy behind having a lean team focus in a lot of areas and a lot of clients whilst doing quality deals?
Yeah, we've always been a fairly lean team. We've really kept it under 10 throughout our existence. Maybe we were at 10, but we're right around that size today. I think part of that is because I've been I think that allows us to really serve our clients well. It allows me to be across everything we do. Doesn't mean I do all the work, of course. We have an amazing team of people here that do incredible work, but at that size, I'm able to engage in an in-depth way with every one of our matters, and I think that's important, and it's how I like to run things. It's worked for us, as you say. We've had a lot, been able to do a lot of great, really interesting work. We do it sort of efficiently. It's at margins that are appealing, etc. So it kind of works in all those ways. And it's funny, I was just talking to someone yesterday and they were saying, like, how are you able to do all the work you do with that small of a team? And you probably won't appreciate this as much being a student, but people who have been in industry for a long time will understand it. I'll say to them, well, and this used to have even more resonance before COVID, but I'll say to them, well, first take your commute out of your day. Right now, depending on where you live, that can be hours a day, right? And again, it used to be more resonant before COVID, but still is for many people. And then take staff meetings out of your schedule, and you probably run a staff meeting, and then maybe you're in someone else's staff meeting whose staff that you're a part of. Then take out performance reviews, then take out monthly projections, et cetera, if you really focus on the business, you can get a heck of a lot done. And so that's what we are here, right? We know we're a boutique, we're focused on the business, and we're able to spend our time and energy on our clients' behalf. So, that's part of our essence, if you will, and part of why functioning in the way that we do, where we're fairly lean and can really focus on the substance of our matters, has worked for us.
A pretty hot topic, which I'd be curious to get your perspective on, is the world of NIL. From your perspective, how has NIL already changed the landscape of college sports, and how will it continue to change moving forward?
This could be the topic of part 2 of our interview, if you'd like. I mean, we could talk forever about NIL and what's happening in college. The college world is virtually unrecognizable from where we were just a few years ago. I mean, it's changed so much, and NIL has been a huge part of it. I think you and a lot of your listeners probably know this, but when NIL began, I think what most people envisioned or hoped for was that college athletes could make reasonable amounts of money in return for the use of their name, image, and likeness, which obviously is what NIL stands for. So it meant, a football player or a basketball player, et cetera, could, sign autographs at the local car dealership and get paid for a few hours' time. Or the tennis player or golfer or baseball player could run a camp in their hometown in the summer and leverage the fact that they were a Duke athlete or what have you, and get paid for that. Of course, the list is long, but it was all about being paid fair value for the use of their name, image, likeness in the way that professional athletes can, or artists, or other types of students. And I think a lot of people were in favor of that. I think what quickly happened was it morphed from that into a world where schools formed what's called collectives, where a school would say to donors and boosters and other supporters, put your money into this pool or collective, and then we're going to distribute it to the players. We're going to pool it and distribute it to athletes. And I think it's widely recognize that became a pay for play kind of concept. Even though the rules prohibited that, one of the very few rules was it couldn't be pay for play. So then athletes were really being paid, to attend and play for certain schools, which I think in a lot of people's views sort of got out of hand and was not really what NIL was meant to be. So now people are looking at different regimes in order to address that. You've probably followed this lawsuit, which is referred to as House, which is an athlete's name. He was the plaintiff in the lawsuit, which looks like it's soon to be settled. And under that settlement, the schools will have the ability to actually pay athletes directly, $20 million or so. And then athletes will continue to be able to do NIL deals, but they're going to be subject to a fair market value test, where if they get, I think it's more than $600, then a third party is going to have to determine whether that's fair value for their use of their name, image, and likeness, or whether it was really sort of a backdoor way for pay for play. So that's going to be a new regime. We'll see how that works. I think determining fair market value is really, really tough. I think there are going to be a lot of challenges around that concept, but we'll see. And the one thing we know for sure is that there's a lot of angst, some would say chaos, within the college sports industry, and it's just going to continue to change, whether it's NIL, realignment, transfer portal, etc. It's an area of the industry that's generating a lot of business for us, candidly, because of all the change. When there's that kind of change, people seek counsel, and I don't see it stopping anytime soon.
I think it's particularly hard, this concept of fair market value, because before the case even happened, colleges thought they were getting their fair market value of nothing. And now it's the fair market value of getting, I think the quarterback at Duke is getting paid something like $8 million over 2 years. And then on top of that, there's no precedent for it. And to the side of that, even if the collectives within universities are taken away, there are still brands and companies and successful alumni who are adjacent to the university and not directly in the pooled fund, which can still pay the athletes. So this might even worsen the divide between schools like Duke and schools that don't have as successful alumni or associations or people connected to it in order to get great athletes.
Yeah, I think the settlement is meant not to, right? I think the settlement is meant to say, Duke and other Power 4 schools can allocate their $20 million how they see fit. Although, by the way, there's looming on the horizon are Title IX challenges, et cetera, to how that money is handed out. But kind of that's a whole nother area of really interesting questions. And then I think, again, what they want is athletes to do true market deals. So, Cooper Flagg does his deal with AT&T. That looks like a fair market deal. AT&T is signing Cooper Flagg instead of signing, an NBA player. But then you have all sorts of other deals, as you say, that with maybe people that are associated with a particular school, which I think are going forward will have to be framed as true NIL deals. So maybe a Duke alum or another school's alum, runs a particular business. They want to get a Duke athlete to endorse their business. Maybe they're motivated to pay a little more than, an unaffiliated person would. And then this new panel, which is going to be managed by Deloitte, will have to say whether that's fair or not. And I just think that's such a hard concept because, I could look at a, women's tennis player and say, I think she's going to end up being a pro and a Grand Slam winner. So I'm going to pay her a lot right now and get in on the ground floor and build a relationship with her so that, a few years from now, when she's in the top 10 in the world, she's endorsing my company, et cetera. Now, is someone at Deloitte going to look at that and say, that's wrong? They don't have the potential to be that? Or I think that athlete X has, charisma and star power and the it factor. So I'm going to pay them more. And someone at Deloitte's going to say, I don't agree. They don't, So, now I haven't seen the details and maybe I'm missing something or maybe, but I whenever people talk fair market value, I get nervous because, again, we're in the business, or part of our business, as we talked about, is selling media rights. And, they're always worth $1 more than what the other guy will pay for them. So we do a lot of math and a lot of rigorous analysis, et cetera. But at the end of the day, value is part art, part science. And so I think all this is going to continue to yield a lot of interesting questions.
Yeah, I think it's just adding unnecessary bureaucracy and stunting growth. I'm conscious of time, and I had quite a few more questions on NIL. and I kind of just want to list them off. The specifics don't matter, more just from a top-down level, but I think would be interesting for the listeners to hear nonetheless. I'd be curious on, there are 6 ideas here, specifics don't matter. I'd be curious on NIL, the impact of amateurs not really being amateur, whether it will take people away from college, well, viewers will be taken away from watching professional sport to amateur sport. Is too much power for a college student a problem? Is it really a college experience for these college athletes? Is it too much money too soon? And will these universities be run, which are public or private entities, have to run more like businesses as they're starting to be involved with so much money? So yeah, specificity doesn't matter, but those are some curious standpoints that I had.
Yeah, those are all great questions. That's why I said we can have part 2 on NIL. But I think, look, I think one thread through a lot of that is, how are we going to sort of navigate all this dramatic change? And, one thing that I try to step back and think about, and we talk about here, is like, first of all, where we are today would have seemed unimaginable a few years ago. And the college world has, navigated that well. Again, I think it's going to look completely different in a few more years down the road. But I do think that people will continue to be passionate about college athletics. I think I hear from so many people, oh, I hate it. I hate that the kids are getting paid. They're not real students, or I hate this transfer portal is such a turnoff, and et cetera. But they're still watching, right? They're still watching. They're still buying the merchandise. They're still buying tickets. So I think that that's likely to be the case as things evolve. It's not guaranteed, and people can't rest on their laurels. But I think that that's likely to be the case, even with this massive change. And one thing that I kind of think about as I think about sort of the types of questions you're asking is look at what the Olympics used to be like. And again, you're too young to remember this, and I'm too young to remember this notion where there was like such total purity in terms of the notion of amateurism. And again, this is going 100 years ago, but sort of the famous story of Jim Thorpe, who made a few dollars playing baseball in the summer, and they took away his gold medals for the decathlon, et cetera. And there were just many, many stories of that. Like, it had to be pure. And if you paid, if the Olympics let in anyone who was paid, it would destroy the Olympic ideals, et cetera. And I think most people that were, watching the Olympics back then, and it wasn't that long ago, would have said, boy, we can't let professional athletes in the Olympics. Now you have NBA players who are all making, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars there, and everybody watches and nobody blinks an eye. And, the Olympics aren't about amateurism anymore. That would be how I would characterize it. I think that's a fair thing to say. At least it's not about amateurism in every sport. And people watch, and people care, and people evolve. So maybe that's an analogy for college where, years from now, you'll say to your kids, oh, I can't believe that these kids are getting paid and it's not true college athletics, et cetera. And they'll look at you like, what are you talking about? This is just what it is. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think it's funny, the statement that you made, and it's so universal across so many different things. They may not want the college portal or for NIL to occur, but they still watch. I remember when I did economics in high school throughout my junior and senior year, and I can recall seeing, this basic supply and demand curve. And I thought to myself, I'd only want to buy an apple juice for $1, right? I'm definitely not paying $6, but I'd probably pay $5 if I really wanted an apple juice. And at the end of the day, these are businesses. It's not just about, in an ideal world, I want an apple juice to be free, or I want it to be only worth a penny. But you're paying for a service by watching college sport. And if there can be an incentive for players to go to the best programs, that's what needs to happen, and is an argument of the free market system. Perhaps there needs to be some oversight with the NCAA, but it's so novel that the actual thing will happen first and the sort of oversight will happen second, as is happening with so many other industries like cryptocurrency and pretty much everything else across the world. We spoke about the fair market value, something that's so hard to determine if you've got a female tennis player that you think will break into the top 10 in the world. Someone like Michael Jordan, when he was only 18 years old and he was signing his first shoe deal. When you're in a creating a deal out of someone that has potential, but you don't, it isn't tangible yet. So like an intangible asset, like, you might call it the Jordan effect. How do you go about negotiating that in media rights for your deal making?
Well, and I don't think you're suggesting otherwise, but we don't represent individual athletes. I think so. We're not involved on either side of that equation. We don't represent the athlete and negotiate their NIL deal, nor do we represent a school or a brand and negotiate with an athlete. But in our world, that would be, again, for example, negotiating a rights deal, and we always say there's a quantitative and a qualitative element of all those negotiations. So when we're looking at the value of certain media rights, we'll build out very detailed, in-depth models suggesting the value of those rights in today's marketplace. And we have folks on our team who are the best in the business at building those models out and showing fair value. But then I always say, these rights negotiations, and it'll be the same with NIL, it's not a math problem. Right, you need to do the math, and that supports your negotiations. But at the end of the day, sort of classic negotiation dynamics take place, and you want to be able to build a narrative around any kind of property or athlete, again, if that's what you're doing, to talk about the growth potential, right, and why it's going to be worth more than ever. And the numbers may suggest X, but you should play X plus Y because this is where we're going to be a year from now, and 3 years from now, and 5 years from now, and then support it with facts, etc. So that's how it plays out in our world, and either you believe it or you don't, right? Either are you a believer. Again, it's different for the biggest properties, but not because it's the smaller properties where you have to tell a narrative about why it's a unique moment in time for soccer in this country because of the World Cup, and then that if you're partnered with us, coming out of that, you're going to have done a great deal. Or even when the NBA did their deal, right? They're huge and established and certainly one of the biggest properties here at the very top of the pyramid. But they had to tell a story about why they're going to continue to their value is going to continue to grow in a changing world, and the next generation of stars being able to take things further, et cetera. And they did an incredible job, and I believed their story. The media partners believed their story, and they got a great result.
For people that haven't yet found success, or even people that might have a lazy mindset, and particularly people in the youth that are coming up and learning the value of hard work, including myself in a lot of times, there's a need for a short fix or a band-aid solution. And to an extent, it's just hard work and experience and learning over time. But as a sort of contradiction to that idea, have you learned any particular negotiating tactics or ways of doing deals that you think would be of value to the listeners?
I can't think of any sort of real sort of quick fix or trick or fun takeaway in that regard. It would be the more boring answer of again, sort of doing your homework, again. And I think what I described applies to virtually any negotiation is doing your homework on the quantitative basis, right? If you're trying to buy a house and you want to negotiate the price down, you got to go in with your facts and figures about what else has happened in the neighborhood and why those numbers support your position, right? And then there's always an element of creativity to explain, again, why it makes sense for the other person. And you always need to be prepared for what they're going to counter with. So you're ready. You have to kind of put yourself in their shoes. I think law school is helpful training in that regard because it helps you to look at all angles of an issue and be ready to rebut whatever they come back with. So kind of there's no magic to that answer, but some philosophies and approaches are classic for a reason, right? Those ring true. Those continue to ring true in a lot of contexts.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different attributes or values that enable people to be successful. But actually, the one that I've found the most by speaking to people, and particularly recently, that have hedge fund managers, VC people like yourself, is the fundamental core is just hard work. Why do you think in 2025 there's such a disconnect between the ideal of what it takes and actually the reality of just hard work to find success?
It's an interesting question. I hear people say that, right? But I see a lot of hardworking young people out there. I think you're right, by the way. That is a critical element of anyone's success. People will often ask me, what do you look for when you are going to hire someone? And I always say it's really simple. I want someone who's going to work hard. I want someone who's smart. It's, as simple as that sounds, someone with, strong analytical skills or quantitative skills, etc. And I want someone that I want to be around, who I'm comfortable putting in front of a client. So it's their work ethic, it's their smarts, for lack of a better term, and it's their personal approach. And they don't all have to be my best friends, but particularly, again, we talked earlier about how this is a boutique and we're around each other all the time. And so it's the way you carry yourself, it's how hard you work, and it's how good you are at what you do. And I always say, especially for junior or even sort of mid-level people, I'll teach you the sports industry, I'll teach you the media industry, but those are the building blocks that you need in order to be successful here. I'm always really surprised, as you know, I have 3 sons who are roughly your age, and I've observed sort of the way that firms could, manage interview processes today, and that kids have to study for these interviews, et cetera, and they want sort of real substantive knowledge as you go through a lot of the interview processes for a lot of certain types of jobs that are particularly appealing to young people. Again, I'm a much bigger believer in, I want to hire the best available athlete, to take a term from the sports world, and I can teach them, the business that they'll be in as a junior person. So, circling back to your question, hard work is critically important. We do see a lot of smart, young, hardworking people out there. If the sense is that's not true more broadly, I'm not sure sort of what's driven any change in society. So many people, when they point to change society, look at COVID and talk about that. And I know there's a lot of thought out there that really changed a lot of social dynamics, and undoubtedly that's had an impact on your question. So I think probably look to that to a broader answer, but I also, I guess, I'm a little bit more of an optimist by nature, see the positive, and I see a lot of really smart, hardworking young folks out there.
What's a question that you haven't been asked before, or that you're often not asked enough?
Nothing is leaping to mind. I think candidly, you've asked a lot of good questions already. So we've covered a lot of the things, that I sort of tend to talk about when I'm, either.
If I was to rephrase, is there a particular thing that a mentor in your life has told you, or a great piece of advice that you've been told that you might tell your sons, or people that look up to you to be able to accomplish something like you've been able to do in your life?
Yeah, we touched on that earlier, but I sort of would emphasize it, which is the importance of relationships. I think we talked earlier about our whole business is built on our relationships and reputation and our domain expertise. But I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate the importance of relationships, and I think it's true. I know it's true for our business and our industry, but I think it's true for a lot of other industries as well. And it's funny. I have a pet peeve. I don't like the word networking. I think it suggests sort of a Machiavellian approach or strategy just to try to achieve what you're trying to achieve, and that's not really what I mean. What I mean is it's about how you carry yourself every day, right? And some of your classmates at Duke will end up being part of your network, and they will have formed an impression of you based on how you treat them in the halls and in the dining hall at WU, how the comments you make in class, etc. And that's you're starting your reputation and your profile and your relationships, and that will be part of your network. And then you'll go to your first job, and there'll be depending on what you do, a class of kids, and the same thing will happen. And it's just how you carry yourself every day. And I always say, especially when you don't want anything, right? Take the time to, go to lunch with people who are in your business, and just learn from them. And again, build those relationships. Be there for people when they're hitting difficult times. If someone, is between jobs, I'm always trying to be as helpful as I can to them because it's the right thing to do. And then sometimes that's come back to benefit us, but that's not why I do it. Don't be, and you can always spot those people a mile away who will call you, hey, I haven't talked to you for a long time. How have you been? And then invariably the next question, they need someone. And that's just not, again, I don't think that's a nice way to be. I also just think it's not as helpful to business. So, I think I've probably gotten a little long-winded on this point, but I think it's just so critical. And treating people the right way it's the right thing to do, and ultimately inures well to your business.
It might be the same answer, but I'll ask it nevertheless. My final question, and I ask this to every guest on Personable, is what is one thing that you would want a listener to take away from this episode?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not. We're not going to have a thrilling conclusion to the interview, because I think it really would be what I just talked about. I think again, it just sounds so simple, but I think no matter what industry you're in, you need to be good at what you do. You need to have that domain expertise. There's no way to hide shortcomings in that regard with personality or your approach to dealing with people. But also, I think for most industries, that's not enough. Again, I've often said, and my dad used to say the same thing, like, you really only need one rule, which is treat people the way you want to be treated. Right? You don't. It's a very short book. If that's what guides you in your approach to life and dealing with others in your personal life, but also professionally, you'll make the right decisions. And again, it's not the reason to do it, but that is also good for your professional life. So, I that's a real big one for me.
Well, thank you very much, Doug, for coming on Personal today. I really appreciate all of your insights, and I feel like I've learned a lot into the sports media and entertainment business, particularly from your perspective. I wrote down the words trust and relationships, and I think that's very pivotal to who you are and what you bring across in your industry and within your own life. I've often been a big fan of the idea of building network and understanding and learning from people. And I think there's a big misconception that most people have, is that particularly the youth only have the connections and the people they know from their parents.
Yeah.
And for me, if having 70 guests on this podcast, I'd be impressed if my parents had 70 friends. So I think it goes beyond the point at which it's just who your parents know, but it's who you interact with. It doesn't mean it won't matter if you're at the best school in the world or the worst. It's the people you're around and how you interact with them on a daily basis. Not what you ask them for, not even what value you provide them with, but those small interactions are what they remember you by, and so it continues into the future. Thank you very much for coming on Personal. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure that my listeners would have learned a huge amount from you.
No, I was happy to do it. I think the comments you just made are spot on, and and I'll add, I'm super impressed with what you've built here and the folks that you've been able to speak to. I think it's a great example of what I've talked about. Is expanding your network, learning from others, etc. And one thing that it reflects, which I'm a big believer in too, is sort of speak up and reach out, and don't be afraid to ask. And a lot of people are happy to be helpful or talk to you, etc. And again, what you're building is a great example of that. So I was happy to do this, and I wish you the best of luck.